Hi, and welcome to another CS0 Intro to Java video. In this video, we're going to cover a lot of stuff. I mean, it's going to seem pretty simple and pretty, like there's not a lot to cover. I'm just going to show you how to draw strings to a Jframe. But in order to do so, we're going to need to do some things like make a button and make that button interactive. So this is going to be a bit of a wild ride, so buckle up and enjoy. Let's get started. In the last video, we figured out how to create GUI components and add them to our Jframe. We have our basic GUI template where we made a JLabel and a JText field. We added them to our Jframe. This video, we're going to add something new from the start. I'm going to run this first before I talk about the new stuff that's going to get added. All right, so what you see here is a Jframe that looks a little different than the previous one. We've got a big white box here, and we've got a button that says draw. I'm going to click on the draw button, and bang, some text appears on that white field. It's some text from the poem The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. All right, so this is our first interactive Jframe. We've got a button that when I click it, things happen. In order to do this, we're going to have to add some new architecture to our basic Jframe template. Let's look at the class header, because this is where it all starts. Public class drawing strings extends Jframe implements ActionListener. Implements. This is a new term. We talked about what extends does. This said that Jframe was an existing class that somebody else had written. Some other developers created a class called Jframe that does all this stuff. It makes frame pop up on the screen. Implements means that we are going to apply a set of rules to this class that some other software development team defined. There are these things called interfaces. And what they are is in short, they're like a list of abstract methods and fields and implementation of statics and things like that. I mean, all that stuff might have gone over your head. That's okay. You don't have to worry about really how to make an interface or what it is in this course at all. You'll get into that in your object-oriented courses. But just know that we implement these interfaces to classes. These interfaces behave like a set of rules or a contract that a class must follow if that gets implemented. So there is an interface that some software development team wrote that's called ActionListener. And ActionListener is going to define a method called Actionperformed that is going to listen for events that take place in the Jframe. An event is something that gets fired off some sort of a GUI component. Things like JCheckboxes, JRadio buttons, JButton, all these things can have events that come off of them. And those events will inform the program that something had happened, and we get to define how the program is going to respond to that thing that happened. So we have now defined our class as an action listener. This class can now listen for events. All right, let's take a look at the structure of the class, and we'll come back to how that action listener comes into play in a little bit. We've got two new GUI components that we're going to use in this class. We have a Jpanel and we have a JButton. A Jpanel is an empty container. And that container is, you have the ability to put all kinds of GUI components in there, but it's also got something special called a graphics context. I like to think of a graphics context as being kind of like a whiteboard in a classroom. You know, I can take some markers and draw on the whiteboard. I can put images up on it. I can write words on it. I can do all kinds of stuff on that whiteboard. Well, Jpanel has one of these whiteboards on it, and we have the ability to write things to that whiteboard. We can draw strings to it. We can draw ovals to it. We can draw rectangles to it. We can draw images to it. We're going to do all kinds of drawing on these graphics contexts. Okay? That's the purpose of the Jpanel in this project. JButton is what it sounds like. You saw when I brought that frame up, it had the button on the bottom that said draw. I clicked on that button and something happened. Buttons by nature are an interactive thing. And when we click on them, they have the ability, if worked correctly, to fire off an event that a listener class can then take in and use. So we'll talk about how that's done in a little bit. So we've declared these two variables of type Jpanel and Jbutton, and we're going to add them to our Jframe. Our main method, we've seen it before, it's got all the things that a main method has. We instantiate our object onto ourselves, we set the size. I've got my method for create GUI, and I'm going to do that in a little bit. Then I set visible. We know we have to do all those things every single time. The create GUI is the method that we created. This method and this method, set size, set video, or visible, come from the Jframe class. All right, so when we get to this place, it goes create GUI. It's going to look through our class and find a method signature that matches it, and then it's going to execute all statements in that method. This is our method invocation for the method that we wrote, frame.createGUI. So we're looking in the frame object for a method called createGUI, and then we're going to execute it. All right, so we're doing the same things that we have always been doing. Set our default close operation. We're going to get our content pane and hold it in a variable called window, and then window.setLayout. We're setting the layout on that container object. Right, we did that in the last two videos. This is not new. Review. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to create our components. We're going to instantiate our Jpanel and call some methods to it. We're going to instantiate our Jbutton. So if you remember last video, we talked about the 3 steps for making any GUI components. First step was your declaration of the variables. Second step was the instantiation of the objects to the variables. And the third step was going to be to add them. So this is how I instantiate Jpanel. You'll notice that there's nothing in the parameter. Jpanel does not by nature take any arguments. We can, if we want, do things like pass layout managers into it, but this Jpanel is just going to be for drawing, and that's it. So we're not going to give it a layout manager because it's not going to get any GUI components. Set preferred size takes a dimension object, and that dimension object takes 2 parameters, which are the width and the height. Now, I didn't explain this in the last video. I'll explain it now. So sometimes method parameters take in objects from other classes. Well, there's this class in Java called dimension. And the dimension is essentially a holder for a width and a height, 2 integers. And we pass those integers into the dimension, and it can be used to set the width and height of different types of components. We think of it kind of as an abstraction. There are a lot of classes out there that create these kind of abstractions. In other words, they're going to hold pieces of data and allow us to wrap it all up into one neat little package, and then it gets easier to work with that little package. Okay? So, set preferred size, and we always do it with the dimension. You set the width, you set the height. Whatever you set these to, it's going to change the size of that panel. So draw panel, set preferred size, dimension. Now you might notice a difference between the way we set the size on the frame and we set the size on the draw panel. Okay? This one, Jframe, has the set size method. Jpanel has set preferred size. I'm not going to go into the difference between them now, but just know that those 2 different classes have different methods for setting the size. Set background. I've got color.white passed into the parameter. Color is a class in Java. White is a constant in that class. If I delete this, IntelliJ has a handy system that when I put the dot operator there on any class or any object, it's going to give me a list of possible either methods or constants that I can work with. So I've got blue, white, decode, get color. I got all those, red, black, blue. I got a bunch of colors that are there, and I can set these to anything I want. So for example, light gray. Hit enter. When I run this, you'll see that the background of the panel is now going to be light gray instead of the white that it was before. See, it's a light gray. We're going to work with set background differently as we move on. But for now, we'll just make it white. And then I'm instantiating my JButton called draw. JButton instantiates just like a JLabel does. It takes in just a string, and whatever that string is going to go on the button as a label. Then we have to add our draw panel and add our button to the window. Now I want to talk about this adding process. Adding, as we saw before, is going to actually put those components on the Jframe. And if we don't add them, they just don't show up. I want to talk about the order in which we add them. The order is important. I'm going to cut that. I'm going to paste the button now above the panel. So button gets added and then panel gets added. Let's see what's different in our program. Now my button is up here and my panel's down here. The way Java works is Java is going to read through all of the programming statements in order from top to bottom. It's going to follow method calls into their definition and then execute all those statements from top to bottom, and it's going to come back to where that method call ended. What you're seeing is that things are done procedurally, step by step by step by step. Now, when things get added to the panel, they get added, to the content pane, they get added in order. So if the draw button gets added first and the panel gets added second, they're going to add in a stack. Either left to right if there's enough room, or top to bottom if there's not enough room. So it's a vertical stack right now. And button gets added first and then panel gets added second. If I want the button to show up below, I put that statement below the panel statement, and now it'll add the draw panel first and it'll add the button second. All right. There we have our GUI components created. Now let's talk about how we make these things interactive. Because you saw that when I pressed that button, a poem showed up in the panel. This is where ActionListener comes into play. By default, a button really doesn't do anything. I can put a button in any GUI I want and not make an ActionListener, and it's not going to do anything. It's just going to be an inert button. You can press it. It'll be fun to press, but it's not going to do anything. To make that button do something, we have to create an action listener, and then we have to register that button to the action listener. So I'm going to talk about that process first, and then we'll talk about what happens with that action listener. So action listener, as I said, is a interface that allows us to make this thing interactive. But to make a component interactive, we have to add one more step to the process of creating a GUI. We said the process of creating a GUI is declare, instantiate or initialize, and add. Well, there's one more step if you want to make it interactive, and that's register components. So you've got those 3 steps that we had in the last video. Add this step to it. So this is step 4, register components. What this means is we are adding the action listener to that component. And if we do that, what's going to happen is that component now has the ability to fire off an event, and our action listener is going to listen to that component for it to be interacted with. So now when I do this thing, draw.addActionListener this, when I press that button, this is going to listen to that button for an event. And when I say this, I mean the instance of the class that has the listener. So this is going to be the object called drawingStrings. So frame right here is my drawingStrings object. The frame is what's being passed into the addActionListener. Given that that frame object is an action listener, that's the thing that I'm adding to the button. This might seem a little weird. If you don't get it, don't worry. Just know that this line has to be in your code for your button to actually be interactive. Now, if you've registered your component to the listener, we can then implement a method called Actionperformed. In fact, we have to implement a method called Actionperformed. Our Actionperformed method is down here. I'm going to do something really quickly. You don't need to do this, but I'm going to select the whole thing. I'm going to comment it out, and then I'm going to go up and look at my method header. My method header says that I've got an error. Now, when you first write your method header on basic GUI template, you're going to see this error is going to come up, and it's going to say drawingStrings must either be declared abstract or implement abstract method action performed. In short, This is that contract that we are signing by implementing ActionListener. As I said, ActionListener is like a contract or a set of rules that we have to follow. If we implement ActionListener, we have to do everything that ActionListener tells us we have to do. And ActionListener tells us that we must implement, or we must define, a method called Actionperformed. So in the class somewhere, outside of the main, outside of any other methods, but inside the class, we have to do this. I'm going to uncomment all this stuff again. We have to define this method called Actionperformed. The method is like this: public void Actionperformed, and then the parameter has to take in an action event. The name of the action event can be anything you want. I'm just going to call it E. That's actually what the IDE defaults the parameter variable name to be. All right, so this is our Actionperformed. What Actionperformed does is when the ActionListener class, in this case drawing strings, hears an event being fired off from a Gui component that's been registered, it will automatically invoke this method. In other words, this method is going to jump into action. And that event that gets fired off of the button, that button when it gets pressed, is going to generate an object. This method is going to take in or receive that object, and then everything in there is going to execute. Right now, we're not going to do anything with that object that comes in. We don't have to. We can, but we don't have to. In a future video, we'll get into the things we could do with those events. But for now, all we're going to do is accept the fact that when a button is pressed, this method gets executed. So if this method gets executed, we have to execute every line of code in it. In other words, that method runs, all this code is going to run. So when I press a button, immediately graphics G gets drawPanel get graphics. What this means is we're going to go to that drawPanel object, which is our Jpanel, and given that we've got the dot operator, we're going to call this method or invoke this method onto this object. And when we invoke this method on this object, what happens is it gives us the graphics context from the Jpanel. In other words, it's going to essentially, in this method, create a whiteboard that we can draw on. And we're going to put that whiteboard, we're going to put that graphics context in a variable called G. So now G is a variable of type graphics that receives that graphics context. And now we can use that object in that variable, and we can call methods on it. So the way objects work is they're living, breathing code that you can modify the way they're behaving through methods. We've seen that in other areas. I'm going to call the drawString method to this G object. I'm going to call it, what is that, about 8 times to print out my poem. drawString is going to take in 3 arguments. It's going to take in a string literal, it's going to take in an int and an int. The first int is going to be the x of my origin. So if this thing is being drawn to the Jpanel, we have to tell the Jpanel where it's going to draw. So we have to look at its coordinates. And we have an origin coordinate. Now we'll take a look at this again and we'll see how this works. Once upon a midnight dreary is at 10 and 10. So it's at 10 pixels to the right and 10 pixels down. So that's right here. The upper left-hand corner of that string is the origin. In other words, this coordinate point here is the upper left-hand corner of the O there. And then it's going to draw it down in this direction. In Java, in any of these Java drawing programs that we do, our graphics context is like a box, and you want to think of it as quadrant 4 in a coordinate plane. Okay? So the upper left-hand corner is 0, 0, and as we go down, the y value gets higher. As we go right, the x value gets higher. So if x is 10, it's going to put it at 10 pixels over to the right. If y is 10, it's going to put it 10 pixels down. Let's say I increase the x value to 100. You'll see that this string is now drawn way over here. And you can see that in all my subsequent calls to drawString, I've got a new string in there, and my Y values are getting higher. So they move down lower in the panel. 30 means it's 30 pixels down from the top of the panel, or from the top of the graphics context. 50 is 50 pixels down, 70, 90, 110, and 130. Those are the Y coordinates of the origins of those strings that I'm drawing. And these string literals that are passed in there, these are just the strings that get drawn to the Jpanel. All right, there you have it. This is how you are going to draw strings to a panel. First, we're going to create our panel. We're going to create our button. We're going to implement the action listener. That means we have to create the action performed. And then we're going to get the graphics in action performed. And then we're going to call the drawString method to all those G's. What I want you to do now is pause the video, and I want you to update basic GUI template. So it's going to have a button, a panel, and it's going to implement action performed, and then in action listener, it's going to, it's going to implement action listener, and in action performed, it's going to draw a couple of strings to the panel. Pause the video, get started on that, and in a second, we'll be back and you'll see my code. Welcome back. My guess is if you're back here, you've done all the things that you needed to do. You wrote the code over in your basic GUI template that's going to give this a button, a panel, and a listener and make it interactive. I did that to mine, so this is my basic GUI template. I'm going to run it, press my button, and my poem draws to it. Lovely. That's exactly what I wanted it to do. There were some kinks that maybe you had to work out when you did this. Let's take a look at how I did it. First thing that I did was I added my declarations for draw panel and button. Okay? Next thing that I had to do, as you know my steps, declare, initialize or instantiate, add, register, give it a listener, and implement action performed. So I am instantiating my draw panel here, setting the preferred size. It's 400 by 400, as you saw before. I'm setting my background color to white. I'm creating my button, calling it draw. And then I'm adding my draw panel and button. I just added them below the input field and below the label because I think that's a fine place for it. I kind of like having the label in the field above it. Next, I had to implement action performed. So on the class header, it's now going to be public class, basic GUI template, extends Jframe, implements action listener. Now, as soon as you do that, what's going to happen is it's going to tell you that you need to implement action performed. So that's going to be right down here. Public void action performed, and then the parameter is action event E. Inside there, I just did all the stuff that I did in the other one. I created my graphics G variable and then assigned drawPanel.getGraphics into it. Okay? So this means I'm using that variable called drawPanel that I declared up here. I instantiated right here, I set its settings here, and now I can use it down here. Remember when I talked about the importance of making your variables at that class level? In other words, outside of the main, but inside of the class. They're not in any methods, they're just in the class. If I do that, it makes them instance variables. Instance variables can reach any method in the class. In other words, I could use it in the main, I could use it in create GUI, and I can use it in action performed. Watch what happens if I declare these two variables in the main instead of in the, I can't make them private in a method, by the way. We'll get to why in another video, but I'm going to declare them in the main. So the process, they're declared in the main. I can't reach them here. They don't exist in create GUI. They don't exist in action performed. So draw panel and draw, now they don't exist anywhere except for in main. That's a problem. This is a concept called data scope that we're going to get to in a future video when we start talking about methods and variables. But for now, just know that it is absolutely important that you declare any variables that you need to use across multiple methods in the class and not in a method. Okay? All right, so we've implemented ActionPerformed. We have defined our ActionPerformed method. We got the graphics on the draw panel, assigned it into this variable. We made the drawString calls to our G object. You know, we set the strings that we want to be in them. We set the coordinates where we want those strings to draw, and then it's ready to go. The last thing that we have to do after we fully implement ActionPerformed is register the button to the listener, so that now the button is going to be listened to by this class, by our ActionListener class, so that when the button is pressed, this class will then hear that event and invoke ActionPerformed. All right, that's the last step of this. Now, you might have noticed that you ran into a little bit of a problem. Before our basic GUI template, we had the height set to something like 200 pixels. And you might have noticed that our draw panel was 400 pixels by 400 pixels. It was too big for the Jframe. So I needed to set the height of the Jframe to something different. I set my size of my Jframe to 420 wide by 600 high. That allowed me to accommodate the width of my panel and the height of my panel with my other components in it. If I want to, I could probably make my Jframe a little bit lower, a little bit smaller, maybe make it 500 pixels instead, but this is okay. You can then pixel push all you want until you get this thing to be the size you want and get things arranged the way you want it. That's really going to be on you when you make your own Jframes. The last thing that I want to talk about in this video is import statements. We've been working with Gui Components now for 3 videos, and I haven't really talked about import statements, but you might have noticed that they need to happen. An import statement is this stuff up here. Above the class header, you're going to find a list of these things that say import and then something. Well, Java, when you write your first basic programs, is only going to use a set of classes and methods that are available to you for all Java programs. But not all things in Java are available. If you look over here, we have all of these libraries. And most of these libraries are not actively available to us in our programs until we make them available. I mean, we've imported them into the project, but if we loaded all of those libraries into every program that we create, you're going to have a lot of memory overhead. In other words, there's just going to be a lot of software installed in that program that's not necessary. So what we do is we import the pieces of software that are necessary to make our program run. And to make our program run, we need things that allow us to draw, and we need things that allow us to have GUI components. GUI components are all going to come from the swing. So we import javax.swing.star. The star means everything inside of swing. And that allows us to just use any of those J components. Next, if we want to do anything in graphics, that's going to be from AWT. So we import java.awt.all. That means we import everything from AWT. In AWT, there's another package called event. And in event, we're going to find things like action event and ActionListener. So we then import those as well. If we don't make these imports, your program won't run because Java's not going to be able to find that software that we're depending upon for our project to run. Remember, what I said before is that every piece of software that we write is built on the bones of software that somebody else wrote. And we have to import those bones into our project to give us that structure that we can pull from to make our project do what we want it to do and look the way we want it to look. All right, we've covered a lot of topics in these first few videos. Now you have the ability to create GUIs, to make those GUIs interactive, to make a panel and draw to the panel. I want you to play around with this GUI template a little bit. I want you to maybe go to that G variable in ActionPerformed and see what happens if you do, I don't know, g.drawOval or g.drawRect. Experiment with those a little bit. Go with your gut and try and figure out how they work and see if you could do something with them. Now we've got one more piece in the puzzle to finish this unit of content, and that's going to be file I/O for images. We have to be able to get images into our project and display images to the screen, but images are an external resource, so we're going to use Java's file I/O in order to do that. Thanks for watching. See you next time.